And we are live. Top stories this week. Apple is looking to design their own processors for the next generation of Macs, starting as early as 2020. So sorry about that loss, Intel. Microsoft's HoloLens 2 could arrive by the end of this year, sporting a custom Qualcomm chipset. So sorry about your loss, Intel, there. And The Nation magazine dropped a monster report on the business of studying cell phone use and cancer. And there's a lot for us to unravel there. So we've got a lot to talk about. Make sure you're charged and ready for episode 299 of the Pocketnow Weekly. Recorded April 6th at noon Pacific, this weekly podcast is where we dissect and discuss those gadgets that make our lives mobile. Smartphones, tablets, and wearables. It's all the stuff you wished existed when you were a kid and you probably weren't as concerned with the medical science surrounding your toys as you probably should have. I'm Juan Carlos Bagnell, senior editor, contributing editor at Pocketnow.com, joined as always by plucky podcast producer, Mr. Jules Wong on the East Coast. How's it going, buddy boy?
Yeah, it's going well. How about you today?
I am froggy as heck. We were talking off air. I think I've been good for almost 10 hours of talking this week. And so wrapping up a podcast at the end of the week, I don't know that I fully recovered. So I'm going to have cool guy McScratchy voice going on for most of this show.
Or if you're froggy enough, then you can do your best, what was it, Paul McCartney impression?
Oh, I don't think. Well, you know what I could pull off is like, you know, when they would end a show, when the Beatles would end a show, that's when they would sing Twist and Shout because their voices were already blown. So if I were going to sing anything right now, it would just be the screaming of, well, shake it up, baby, now. And that's already enough of the song to get us a copyright strike. So
either that or like all the other kinds of stuff that has come out of Paul McCartney's mouth in the past 30 years or so.
I really feel like that's a different podcast we need to have, Jules.
Yeah, it is a different podcast.
What came out of Paul McCartney's mouth podcast, brought to you by Pocketnow.
Oh boy, this is well, we've been looking to have a second podcast on our network, so let's have that on. Why not? Indeed, yeah. And if you don't prefer to talk about that topic, then you can talk about these smartphones, tablets, smartwatches, whatever the heck that we're talking about this week. And you can do so via Twitter. You can talk with us as we're broadcasting live with the hashtag PN Weekly. If you have any thoughts, questions, or whatever, just send along that tweet and we'll be able to read that throughout the show. And if you can't make it to the show, if you want to still get in on the questions and answers and whatnot, then head on over to your email client and type in podcast@pocketnow.com along with your message, and we'll be able to read that at the end of each month in our mailbag episode. So definitely get involved, join us. We wouldn't be here without you.
Yeah, and we already have a few tweets coming in. We got a great question from Renato Laporte on Twitter, which we're going to cover when we get to one of our stories about Motorola this week. So yeah, definitely looking for you guys to join that conversation, the live stream, the Twitters, the emails, all that fun stuff. And we'll make sure we have a nice, fun chat. And especially this week is we've got some news, which is, I think, going to be a little tough for us to chew through, a little tough for us to unravel later in the show. For those of us who are enthusiasts and fans of mobile technology, it's these types of stories which I think give us pause into our own consumer behavior. So I really hope that we can have a good dialogue, a good back and forth with those of you who are watching our stream.
Indeed. And there's plenty of outside material as well in regarding to that. I duly suggest that if you're watching live right now, just head into the rundown. It should be in the description on the YouTube page. And actually go scroll down to the link for The Nation magazine did this huge article titled How Big Wireless made us think that cell phones are safe, a special investigation. And we'll be doing that at the second half of our show. But in the meantime, we've got plenty of news still to talk about. So for the week of April 2nd, 2018, this is all the news that is fit to podcast. I was about ready to talk.
You already bounced. Come on.
Yeah. All right. For the week of April 2nd, 2016, this is all the news that's with the podcast. Bloomberg reports that Apple is looking to replace Intel processors on its Macs with its own design, though it's not clear if it will continue to reference ARM blueprints as it has done for the iPhone and iPad. Market analysts say that Intel will likely see limited impact with one of its biggest business relationships if Apple is to wean in these new chips, especially on the lower end where they make up less of the Intel share in Macs. In related news, Intel may be falling out of favor at Microsoft for the next HoloLens device. Instead of a Cherry Trail core processor for the HoloLens 2, we could be seeing an ARM chip as well, along with custom AI and holographic processors. This could allow a standalone unit to survive longer on battery power. Coming up to Xiaomi here, and the Chinese company is looking forward to officially debuting its new sub-brand focusing on gaming. April 13th, at least in China. Black Shark is also set to release a Snapdragon 845 phone with liquid cooling, among other features that gaming enthusiasts should be looking forward to. Motorola is setting itself up for an April 19 event in Brazil. It could possibly launch the Moto G6 with Snapdragon 600 chips and extra tall displays at this event. A longer shot would be the entry-level Moto E5 coming out. It has been a year on since the Moto E series got an update, so possibility is there. Japan Display is looking to scrape together $500 million to patch up its lackluster LCD business. Doing so will involve the sale of one of its newer OLED plants. The iPhone X's poor sales performance seems to have a chilling effect on OLED production at this moment. JDI hopes to get a piece of the LCD pie back with Apple's iPad business. Google has rolled out rolling study halls in 3 rural school districts in North Carolina, South Carolina, and new this year in Colorado. The pilot program started in 2016. Wi-Fi is being equipped onto school buses that make long treks to shuttle kids to and from school in places where home internet service is poor. Google has been able to increase student engagement with its program and encourage teachers to implement more digital elements to lesson plans. ZTE has partnered with Taboola to show its so-called newsfeed off on its phones. What it relies on, for the most part, is paid content from brands. The integration will allow a widget to be shown and for the Google feed at the far left side of the home screen to be replaced with this new pane showing off stories and such. ZTE had promised to revert its Android experience to a more stock look with its rollout of Oreo. It's not clear how this integration will take place going forward. And finally, there's word from Evan Blass, Top Leaks journalist, that LG has decided on naming what's supposed to be the G7 ThinQ, like it did the V30S ThinQ. ThinQ being the brand for LG's artificial intelligence enriched products. So there you go. Thank you very much, LG.
Cool.
Yeah,
so,
hooray.
Is that the savior? The G7 is dead. Long live the G7. Is that what we're expecting?
Yeah, that's supposed to be the phone that saves us from our dumb smartphone troubles and how dumb the G6 was, I guess. How dumb the V30 is. It's just dumb. They're all stupid.
I just I don't know. I'm having a hard time with this sort of philosophy. Again, the same way that Bixby on Samsung can do some really cool things, and I think there's some interesting consumer benefit. I'm not sure that this is the killer solution for getting people excited about smartphones again. My V30 just got the Oreo update, and I've been playing around with the camera, and the auto mode got a nice little touch. I actually posted a photo on my Instagram this morning. Just, full auto. I'm liking the output a little bit better than when I first got the V30, but I can't say I'm really I can't say I'm super impressed by the AI camera modes. the way that it alters exposure and it alters post-processing. I think there are some interesting ideas there. I think Huawei's kind of in the same boat. We've got this whole neural processing unit on the chipset just to chew up and figure out what it is that you're pointing the camera at. And while that's cool, I mean, there's some cool technology on display. I'm still not sure that it's really improving my photography that much when I'm trying to shoot just like a general consumer full auto, let me just point my camera at something and hit the shutter button. It doesn't really feel that much different than most other phones' normal auto or HDR modes.
Well, what we seem to know is that the LG G7 in render leaks and whatnot is that there will be 4 buttons. They're taking the Samsung strategy here wholesale, because you got the 2 volume rockers on the side, and then you get 2 more buttons, so one of them has to be a power button. And if that's the case, that would take the power button off of the fingerprint sensor at the back for the first time in a while. So what's that extra button? Could it be a ThinQ Bixby button thing? That's it doesn't have people enthusiastic about how AI is going to be shoved into our faces. We don't want it to be, it's right there at the top of a finger, but really it's like we're going to accidentally tap on it and it's going to be plop. Let's get out of that for a second.
Because even though I really do like some of the individual features that Bixby brings to the table, and it has improved, I still disable the Bixby buttons on my Note and my Galaxy S8. I'm not looking forward to having that same extraneous piece of hardware on an LG. And if they do move the fingerprint sensor, I mean, if the home button off the back of the phone, I'll be really sad, because this is something I've enjoyed about LG design since the G2 power button on the back of the phone. I've really enjoyed that. That'd be a bummer.
That would be a bummer for me as well. How much more ham-fisted can it get with the name, though? Because I'll admit they started off last year, I think, with Smart ThinQ. Like that's all one word, SMARTHINQ, and which is not supposed to be a word in any human language ever. So I don't know why this is a good idea. Why the V30S plus ThinQ was allowed to be a phrase used in marketing. That's not really making sense.
And again, because I agree with you, it's just clumsy. We want something that consumers can identify. Galaxy branding for Samsung works really well. They've got a huge portfolio of products under that Galaxy umbrella, but it's an abbreviated way of getting the consumer immediately into thinking about one particular class of products. And LG has struggled with that. The aesthetics on their devices, what they want a G series phone to look like versus what they want a V series phone to look like. And now that they've kind of figured out a design language, they're still struggling IMO with things like branding. ThinQ isn't going to mean anything to consumers, and it's barely enough of a feel-good word that will resonate emotionally. And it sounds a lot like thank you.
We are eternally grateful for this artificial intelligence service.
I'm really well. I mean, for me, it was more the the LG. It's like we're eternally grateful for those of you who buy our products. I mean, there's something.
There has to be some form of ingratiation, given that the freaking mobile division has been cutting. It's been losing for about a year straight now.
And to that, I mean, there's a good idea in there somewhere, but it doesn't feel like it's fully baked. Or there's an interesting thought in showing gratitude to a consumer base and trying to bring people into the fold, and like you were saying, ingratiating. But this is a stage one on the blackboard idea, not a let's go to market idea yet. This has not been refined enough. And I think we're seeing just a little too much of how the sausage is made, that it'll be tough to unravel, or it'll be tough to come back to this brand and say like, oh, well, this is their flagship premier product with one of their flagship features, and this is why consumers should be interested in it. And consumers are going, but what is ThinQ? Or what is ThinQ or ThinQ or thank you.
ThinQ, like it's a very thin letter in the alphabet.
Yeah, it's a two-dimensional Q. It's that thin.
Yeah.
So I don't know that this is the killer find. It really, I mean, whatever additional fun or AI features they put on this phone, I just hope they deliver a solid device. The G6 was such a big step in the right direction. Evolving off of that would be great, and trying to continue pushing out the messaging on what makes an LG device unique. You're not going to get there by copying a Bixby-like feature. You're not going to get there by copying Apple's notch. There has to be a differentiator. And if they continue to use like the best audio processing in a phone, just give us a commercial on that. Give us that Apple style commercial on you want to have the best. This is the best. And there isn't really much room for debate there.
Yeah. You talk about Apple stylings here. I want to move on to the Intel story here. Now, Apple, I should say, has been working on a sort of merger between Mac OS and iOS in terms of the app ecosystem there and their interoperability. And that could be one sign of this whole ARM-based infrastructure going over to some Macs, perhaps the low end, maybe the MacBook Air in like 2020 or something like that. It's plausible.
I think it's more than plausible. I think it's necessary. Because this Qualcomm story, this Intel story happens on two fronts. Apple considering redesigning the chipset for, say, a MacBook Air. Let's keep it simple. We're going to say a MacBook Air as my futuristic hypothesis. At the same time, we've been seeing Microsoft making big strides on getting Windows 10 on ARM. So this news of HoloLens isn't particularly disruptive to the industry. There's very little movement happening on HoloLens, but it's another data point to show that Intel's domination on chipsets has the potential to be rocked substantially by a newer class of lower power and portable devices. And I think it's another data point to show consumers, man, you're spending $1,000 on a phone. Are you potentially overbuying for some of this high-end hardware, which you might not be really utilizing to its fullest? You know, a Qualcomm 845 is a substantially powerful mobile chipset. What are you doing with it? And might you have been just as well served by a lower power product? So I would be very concerned at Intel. Their current strategy, like I got to play with the new Nook. Again, this tiny little box, which is surprisingly powerful from Intel, but the entire industry right now is diversifying around different implementations of ARM and different implementations of low power x86. So this is a very sensitive transition for Intel to manage, and it's not great for them if Apple is looking at taking one of their product lines away. Apple only makes up, what did you guys put in the article? Apple makes up about 5%.
5%. Some of the market analysis says that the lower end Macs make up about 2%, so that the higher end makes 3%.
So we probably, I mean, again, if I'm putting on my prognosticator cap, I would say that any shift in the strategy would probably start with a single Apple Mac product line, something like the MacBook Air, and likely won't disrupt the overall Core i5 or ultra low power, ultra low voltage chipset strategy that Apple's employed on other things. And you're definitely not going to switch over to ARM for a Mac Pro, which we hopefully will see a proper redesign on that in the next year or two. So Intel's safe there, but it does set up sort of a new conversation in what consumers need versus what they want. Apple pushing into ARM territory for a MacBook makes a lot of sense. Windows 10 operating on ARM makes a lot of sense. And if you're not doing anything that requires the heavy lifting of a Core i5 or a Core i7, you'll be well served on an ARM chipset. Not to mention all of the education market that's looking at these products too. Chromebook and what Google can do in this space is going to be extremely formidable. And Intel doesn't really have much of a say in that market at all. They don't have much of a presence in that ultra low cost laptop market from Google. So this is the beginning of what could potentially be a very disruptive change for how we look at is Intel as a chipset supplier.
Agreed. And I think a lot of that has to also do with the form factor here because there's still war going on between traditional laptop and the convertible two-in-one. You know, you have the optional stylus. Manufacturers are trying to still figure out what to do with that and whether
Yeah.
the ARM infrastructure makes sense go more
Well,
with the convertibles. Yeah.
and this also opens up a huge potential for Intel. Like I said on the Nook, it's this tiny little box. It's got tons of I/O. It is ridiculously powerful just on its own, and it can come in a fanless design. This is a huge opportunity for Intel to really start pioneering the connection and protocols for a more modular system. Like, say you've got an operating system which follows you around, and you've got an ARM powered phone that you can cradle into a dock that has like a Core i7 and a discrete graphics card all connected through Thunderbolt, and you can connect that with big mass storage and really fast solid state drives to then move your portable life immediately into a more desktop grade environment, and that can be a seamless transition. There's a potential for
Indeed.
Intel to really lead in a market segment like that, where I don't need to have a phone, a tablet, a laptop, a desktop. I can just have one computing operating system source that follows me to whatever display and whatever infrastructure that I really need. If Intel can get ahead of the conversation on that, then I think they set the stage for the next generation of data and services. How services follow you from screen to screen. That's a really big get, though, and that Qualcomm is going to be aggressively fighting in exactly the same space. Apple now taking its chips and looking at how it can control more of its hardware. Microsoft same. This is a really shaky market right now, and I wouldn't discount a resurgent AMD also joining the conversation soon too.
Well, not without SoftBank, say, because they
Right.
they own it at this point, and they're pouring good money into it. So you look forward to that going forward. I want to switch gears into Black Shark or Xiaomi for the sake of conversation here, because I while I don't necessarily see Black Shark being a direct competitor to Razer at this moment, if Xiaomi's continued campaign into the Western world goes on, perhaps this could be an interesting thing. So we'll have to keep tabs on this. But already we're talking about this phone for April 13th with a liquid cooling system, according to this article. At least that's from the China Mobile or Mobile China, not China Mobile. That's a telecom. Mobile China, man. And so liquid cooling and perhaps a discrete GPU. So that suggests not using the Snapdragon 845's Adreno 630. Now, what could take its place is would be an interesting factor here. But yeah, what do you think of this kind of upstart within an upstart, formerly known as an upstart?
No, I think this is a great play. This is the right time to be looking at specialist flavors, enthusiast flavors of devices. And if you think you can make a premium argument for a very specific demographic, then now's the right time to make that player to take that chance. I think a lot of consumers feel like they're well served by all-rounder gadgets, but if you're really into a particular brand, like the Razer lifestyle, Razer consumers are super into their Razer hardware, their Razer look, their Razer aesthetic, and having a phone that matches their laptop is part of a conversation which makes sense aesthetically for that kind of consumer. So has been Xiaomi has been pulling off some really interesting and some really exciting design conversations with mobile devices and throwing their weight behind a niche like gaming. I think they could do very well. I also think that they have enough critical mass in terms of users and fan base that they could be disruptive in that kind of a conversation. You're right. I don't think they're directly going to compete against Razer because I think Razer is best served by Razer fans. So a Xiaomi isn't going to be able to pull a Razer fan away. That just doesn't work psychologically. But that also means that there's a huge number of other people out there that might be looking for something specific in how they use their phones. And just like Red might be able to make an enthusiast argument for people who are cinematographers and having a phone which complements their camera lifestyle, I think Xiaomi can also make a similar argument, and they have the resources to back it up.
Andrew Wallace, Fat Produce on Twitter, hashtag PN Weekly. I hope that mystery button on the new LG G7 is a two-stage shutter button, and we all know that the two-stage shutter button died with Sony.
Well, it hasn't died. I mean, we're going to be putting out a video probably tonight on the XA2 Ultra, which I've been spending the last week reviewing. But
it's gone. If Huawei didn't put it on its freaking P20 with its 3 cameras.
But I think, you know, any other manufacturer that wanted to treat us well and look at that could make an argument for it. That's what's so frustrating is we see so many manufacturers try, like, dip their toe into some really interesting ideas and then just not back it up with any consumer conversation or consumer education. And that's where a lot of these good ideas just go to die. You know, water resistance on phones was sort of a niche feature for years, and then Apple finally got on board with better lifestyle resistance, and now we expect and we demand that a premium phone is going to have some kind of high IP rating. The same thing with camera tech, same thing with audio tech. There are all of these opportunities for Razer with screen tech. I think they did a good job of saying, like, there's a reason why we went with this display. There's a reason why it's going to be a benefit to you. And this is a reason why it's different from our competition. It's just that they're a first generation phone brand, as far as many consumers are concerned. So
and they don't have that character that Razer has built among its fans, because, I mean, one of the other tweets that we got were now Laporte at _Reina _Chan _ too many underscores, man. Why Razer in 2 hashtags? Hashtag RGB, hashtag Chroma, and there's a GIF too with all the LEDs behind that keyboard just swirling around in that rainbow murkiness. And that's one of the things that Razer fans point to right from the get-go. If you can't make that freaking snake logo glow green, then what's the point, man? Like, so I mean, in terms of being able to carve out a personality in a place where personality is well appreciated, where there's much of it to go around, with streamers and other fans just being all excited about gaming franchises, and with a partnership here with Tencent, major games publisher, in addition to being the ubiquitous Chinese internet company. Being around, this should be an interesting launch, to say the least.
And now's the right time again just to focus on gaming for that one extra step. Esports are starting to take off in Western communities. We're seeing more collaborative play, and we're seeing those pushes, the experimental builds and alpha builds on Fortnite and PUBG. Now is the right time to try and lock a good chunk of the market and build that brand loyalty with gamers who are looking for a premier experience in a mobile device on some of these titles. Xiaomi has the right kit, Xiaomi has the right infrastructure to make an argument for why someone should consider one of their products.
And they're all around the world these days. Russia, lots of Western Europe. One of our YouTube chatters, Ree Basilar, says Xiaomi's officially in Portugal now. Thank you for that. And again, US in maybe late this year, early next year. So
yeah,
lots to evaluate right there. Meanwhile, in Brazil, we got Moto G6 fever going on here, especially with this color of the invite being green and all the wallpapers and the Moto G6 renders being green. Oh my god, that's something happening too. That's great. I'm wondering, in 2018, how you feel the Moto G, which is supposed to be the one and only mid-ranger, like, this is, you know, great value for buck. How it's evolved over the past 5 years now.
Yeah, no, Motorola's strategy here is a little concerning. I really hope over this next year they take some time to clean up these product divisions. The G series is the perfect example of brand bloat, where I think for the G5 we had 4 different flavors, if I'm not mistaken, of the G5 to the G5S to the G5S Plus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it starts to feel a little like, like a bad revisit of the early days of Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers and Street Fighter 2 Tournament Edition and Street Fighter 2 Ultra. We don't want that. It's really hard to communicate what the granular differences are between those various devices. But I think Motorola could do really well with a 4 gadget strategy. Entry level with the E, super low power hardware, big battery. Done. That part of the conversation's been managed. Entry mid with the G series. Every kind of lifestyle daily feature, well serviced, well taken care of. This phone is going to have no problems getting you through the day. Stepping up to the X, where we start incorporating more premium options, and then Z is their flagship line.
It's sort of like how Samsung is treating their deal with like the A's and the J's and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
Although, like, it should be mentioned that Lenovo is cutting Motorola down to the bone, and even that, like, they're cutting down into the portfolio as well. I mean, we heard that the Moto X series, at least for this year, got canceled. So if you have to resort to the
And we look at some huge opportunities that I think Motorola might have missed out on when we're talking about the potential of something like an entry-level Pixel device next year, and the relationship that they had with Google and the manufacturing partnership that they had with Google, and how the Moto X became the Project Fi mid-ranger phone. Moto still had the right DNA, but I feel the move that we saw last year was such product variation, such product stridation, seemed like a panicked response. We've got to put out a phone for this market. We've got to put out a phone for this demographic. We've got to do this. We've got a slightly better technology over here. We've got, super cheap, dual camera sensors that we can incorporate over there. And instead of just battening down the hatches and saying, this is our course, these are our product lines, and being able to efficiently communicate that to consumers, I think they kind of went a little nuts. If Motorola gets stripped and it causes them to refocus and to come back to some kind of sense in product strategy, that could be a good thing. Unfortunately, it's just all too often we see where gutting a brand like this often leads to products that don't really seem to inspire much consumer affection. So it's sticky, but I'm always going to be excited to see a new Moto G launch. From the G4, I've been very impressed with how they talk in that $200 to $300 price segment, and how increasingly it's one of the flagship devices that you can point to say this is an uncompromised experience for the price point. And they're well joined by Honor. Like, I don't think we'd have the Honor 7 that we do today if it hadn't been for the Moto G4 and G5. So those types of companies competing in that entry level to mid-ranger space is always exciting to me to see what they can offer consumers. I'll just be curious to see how the G6 joins that conversation, or if we're going to see 5 different versions of the G6. That's going to be a major fail for Motorola.
Tiger Kim on the YouTubes. Street Fighter 2 U Ultra X ThinQ is the best game of all time. I personally like to refer to longtime LA sportscaster Keith Olbermann's references to ESPN Tartar Control.
Well, this is also coming in from Renato Laporte using the PN Weekly hashtag. Do you think will Motonovo? I don't like Motonovo. I like Lenovo Moto. Will Motonovo use the Leica G6 song for its Moto G6 promotions?
Can we kill that song already? Like, that's
no. See, I was mad that LG didn't do it. I actually asked an LG rep point blank, like, why? Like, why did you not use Leica
LG
G6?
was like, say, like The Verge, the guy there, or whoever it was, asked, and they said, "Oh, we never really thought of that. We're going to take that into consideration." It sounded like they were kind of, yeah, we're just gonna leave now. Bye. What
I got from the one LG rep that I talked to was like, oh, well, we don't do anything like what's expected. So that would have been expected. So that's why we didn't do it. And it was like, I know you're just, covering, but it's just such an, you
can't afford the ASCAP fees.
I was going to say there's definitely a licensing issue there, and maybe Motorola won't have the cash reserves to have an advertising campaign with that song in it. But just because it's an obvious get doesn't mean that wouldn't have been a fun branding exercise, a fun commercial to put out there, a fun advertisement to put out there.
Yeah, way to drive off all the older people that want, or the people over 35.
But even then, I mean, you make it a punchy, fun, playful kind of, satirical, maybe even commercial utilizing that because it's so obvious. The thing is, a G6 Motorola isn't the right, you don't want an entry level device, pimping out your G6 plane, like it's the wrong fit. But there's a part of me that still kind of hopes that Lenovo will say, like, yeah, let's just license that song and
maybe
we'll make
like the G6 is, that's all it takes these days, a good rounded processor and just like the basics. And it's even faster than the G6 plane that used to fly in our airs. I don't even know what the G6's specs. Yeah, I don't know. One way that I would want to know, if I were living out somewhere in like maybe Four Corners area of New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah, or somewhere that doesn't have internet that is good at all, would be on a rolling steady haul. And I just, given that there's some of uncertainty that I've included into our rundown this week, I just wanted to end on a positive note by saying, hey, good on you, Google, for just making sure that kids are connected and they're able to learn, especially with more lesson plans being digital and having these teachers being able to take advantage of that.
This is, I think, a wonderful initiative, and it's one of those things that we can point to as a data point which expands beyond just education. We start talking about things like self-driving cars. One of the things that we can talk about is just how much wasted time you have in major metropolitan areas because of commuting, especially with the current housing situation the way it is. I mean, not even just for being productive, but stress and the effects of health on sitting in a car at your red zone peak of agitation because of traffic buzzing all around you. This is not a good environment for evolved primates to be in regularly, let alone every single day, and the effects that it has on family life, on like I said, on health, on productivity. Even being able to take that off of your plate and just have some downtime, or being able to engage in a video call with family and friends and not have to worry about operating your motor vehicle would be a huge get. So this to me is both encouraging because of the actual educational benefits to giving students time to prep into their day on their bus ride, and then also time to unwind out of their day on their bus ride is extremely compelling. And then hopefully we can expand that. I mean, if we're raising, if we're training kids, the next generation of consumers, for this type of connected lifestyle, hopefully that generational push into things like better public transit, better commuting, and better self-driving cars will just carry over. I used to be able to surf the internet on the bus when the bus would just drive me. I don't need someone to drive me, but I don't want to have to ride in a car focused on operating that motor vehicle when I could be more productive, or I could be healthier, or I could be able to keep up with my family and friends better. That to me would be a huge benefit for our society.
Indeed. And with that out of the way, all that news done.
Done.
It's finished. Done. It's finished.
It's over.
It's over, and it's now time to rack our brains a bit here, because we're now transitioning into the big discussion that we're going to have here with this piece from the Nation magazine, done by Mark Hertsgaard and Mark Dowie. By the way, Mark Hertsgaard appeared on the NPR program produced here in Boston, actually, on point for like 30 minutes, talking about his piece here. Definitely an interesting take onto some of the questions that were raised with the callers there. We'll probably link to that after the show. But I want to just start off here with the basis of this piece here, because this is a politically progressive outlet here, but that doesn't mean that you should, great journalism comes from both sides of the aisle, or multiple sides of the aisle, I should say. And the basis here is, not just that cell phones are cancerous and you should stop using them. It's not that at all. It's that the money that firms like the CTIA or the GSMA, or the whole industry, the wireless industry, has put into the obfuscation of research that links increased cancer risk with wireless radiation is astounding. Astounding to the point of even big tobacco trying to conceal the harmful effects of smoking.
Well, and again,
which
not
they've spent billions of dollars on.
to hold back research, but in trying to confuse the discussion with contradictory research. It took us generations of people to unravel just how bad smoking really was for you, because there was a concerted effort by the tobacco industry to muddy the waters on certain pieces of research. So for every study that came out that said smoking was terrible for you, at the same time they were putting out their own research and their own studies just to keep consumers confused or divided. And this is something that we've seen happen, play out in numerous industries, in numerous conversations. You don't have to prove the counterpoint. You don't have to lie or try and convince consumers that, this research is false or faulty or anything like that. All you have to do is just keep raising the question, and all you have to do is just keep the conversation. There are people on both sides, and as long as you can engage in that kind of an information campaign. What's the quote from the tobacco industry? Not
I wouldn't
confusion is
know,
our
actually.
product, or something
Confusion
like
is your
that.
product. Yeah. Well, I mean, just not going into the subject at all, but with the global warming, the common thought number that they throw around is that 97% of scientists agree that there is man-made effects to accelerating climate change. And the discourse sounds like it's more like half and half.
Well, and
So
because the thing is, they won't ever say that there's a percentage of scientists who disagree. It's just that there are scientists on both sides of the debate, and then that makes it feel like there's some sort of parity in the disagreement, or that there's some kind of bigger debate happening in the scientific community when a majority of scientists. And this is also one of the things that companies and corporations can always leverage against the scientific community, in that there's never a proper 100% agreed upon fact, lock it in rule when it comes to the scientific process. The way that science should work at its best is everything should be an evolving conversation based on the information we have today and based on the research that takes place tomorrow. There should always be a moving target, and there should always be uncertainty. It's why the top order of trying to predict the outcome of a situation in the scientific community is called the theory. And that means something very different to scientists than it means to colloquial consumers. Where theory means guess to many people, in the scientific community, a theory is the highest order of trying to predict the behavior of a system. That's why we don't call it the fact of gravity. We call it the theory of gravity. We call it the theory of relativity. That isn't to say that someone just guessed about gravity one day and we just kind of all went along with that guess. It's because we have a very good working model of how gravity operates in our universe, and we can predict how things will happen to a point where we can send rockets to Mars and land rovers on the surface of another planet, because we have a pretty good understanding of how that goes down. We can predict how planets will align themselves over vast stretches of area of distance, and significant periods of time, so that we can shoot these tiny little rockets across our solar system. So when we get into some of the business practices, because we'll dig into this article in a little bit more depth, and it's a long article, so we're barely going to be able to scratch the surface of what the nation is reporting on here. We're really just hoping to raise this conversation with the people who follow our show. We're seeing similar practices, which make me feel that there's more there, like in the way that we would find in the food industry, in the tobacco industry, and in discussions on things like climate science. That makes me that's very unsettling. And it's very concerning to me, as I've been a longtime advocate of mobile technology. I've been a longtime proponent of the benefits of having supercomputers in your pocket. And I've been one who's only casually read up on the science, and I haven't found anything that I really found to be particularly compelling, while at the same time, there's been an obvious effort to manipulate the kind of information that I would have had access to. And that makes me more than just a little bit upset.
Well, you brought up the big tobacco phrase, the confusion is our product. There is an analog to that, and that was found in a 1994 paper from Motorola that said, that they were trying to war game, or they are war gaming the narrative here on, as Mark Hertzgaard has put it multiple times, an untested public health factor here. Then, like, what was it, like 1978, 1983, like the first mobile networks, this wireless radiation was not really tested for its health effects.
Yeah.
And it took up until a decade till we had like the first real lawsuits and the first real signs of things. Reynard versus NEC. NEC produced phones at the time, and David Reynard was suing on behalf of his wife, who died from brain tumors linked. He alleges linked to her mobile phone usage, and like the test, like the X-ray showed lots of site activity from the way that she held her phone. So there was, and from that stemmed a whole bunch of activity. Congress was going to investigate, but more importantly, the CTIA, the Cellular Telecommunications and Internet Association, was going to say, okay, let's fund a huge research project that dangled the most money in that research field to date in 1995, $28 million. And they assigned one of these leaders, these corporate things, George Carlo. He had led research studies into Agent Orange dioxins and breast implants, and he was doing it with industry-backed money. So, he found that there was little impact, but somehow, through quite a few theatrics here, in 1999. Now, part of this too was long playing the game, because if you're able to grow the economy of mobile phones, then already people are already dependent on mobile phones, and there's not much that you can do about
that. A win here isn't whether or not you can instantly disprove the hypothesis that cell phones cause cancer. It's, can you delay the verdict on that for decades? And if you can delay for a substantial amount of time, then the industry is still operating, is still growing, and is still finding a consumer base becoming hooked on these products before you can get out whatever negative effects there might be. And at the same time, you can also be investing in multiple other studies and multiple other scientists and multiple other research firms to try and have counter information to when those initial studies are produced.
So, finding in 1999 that there was a positive correlation with cell phone use and increases in neuroepithelial tumors, that there was an emphasis on children's health, because they're still developing brains, are more susceptible to this kind of radiation. Carlo circulated a letter to the CTIA member organizations, Atlantic Bell and Sprint at the time, others included, that they should do the right thing. And then CTIA chairman Tom Wheeler, who would later become FCC chairman later in the Obama years, he basically just shut it down. He tries to discredit Carlo in the media to great success. And back when the CTIA held its 2000 convention, basically he sent two bouncers to whisk Carlo in and out of the convention to deliver like a 12-minute speech, and he not much was done. Like he made sure that Carlo couldn't talk to journalists before or after the event. So there was a lot of it's just one of the like the tiny moments of drama but it really encapsulates what measures were being taken to protect the mobile industry's interest at the time.
And so part of the issue with this is we don't have an infrastructure that's been around for very long at the scale that we would be fearful of, I think, a public health crisis. Now we have a saturation point of wireless technologies in first world nations, and we're seeing tremendous ground being made up in developing and emerging 3G and 4G areas of the world too. So the numbers on this start to look a little scary because none of them can really point to a direct causation. But we're seeing data points that correlate with changes in our industry. We just haven't had enough time. When I had a sit down, I recently interviewed an audiologist about hearing loss. And over the last 10 years, you would think 10 years is a significant amount of time to study a trend, but we're barely scratching the surface on how consumer
It
media
takes lifetimes.
it takes lifetimes. Consumer media habits over 10 years is not enough data to determine what the potential cause and the potential effects of a new technology might be. And at the same time, technology is rapidly changing. So by the time you've even got like a testing protocol lined up, what you're testing for might not even exist for the consumer sphere anymore. So we got a tweet from Renato Laporte. To be honest, how do you study something like that? You'd need a control group, a group that was never exposed to electromagnetic radiation produced by our devices' antennas. It really is impossible to study this. And if you're doing that kind of a control sample survey, then yes, that's true. But that means we need to come up with some other methodology of testing this and some other way of surveying this, because the answer, well, I guess we can't do anything, isn't good enough. If the answer is, well, we'll just wait for 3 generations of people to potentially come down with terrible cancer in their head, that's not an acceptable solution. And from what the industry has been able to unravel, and Jules, I'm sorry, I've got the article up, but I can't find the section on this. When we look at the division between studies backed by independent research and independent funding and studies backed by uh, funding that came from the telecommunications industry, what are the numbers? There's something like 60,
yeah
40?
So Henry Lai was I believe the University of Washington professor that was looking into some studies here. 1990 through 2005, 56% of the studies found an effect between cell phone radiation and cancer causing, 44% not. But when accounting the funding source, 67% of independently funded studies found a biological effect. 28% from industry funded studies found a biological effect. So the majority of the industry funded research found no link.
Right. And when we normalize for where funding came from, a significantly higher number of studies are finding some link to this type of concentrated radiation source affecting DNA, affecting the structures in the ear, and affecting the blood-brain barrier, which acts as a buffer, as opposed to studies funded by the industry, which find significantly less causal or correlation between those behaviors and those mechanisms.
Yeah, and I got to add, like the specific absorption rate of that sort of radiation, those standards are pretty much a self-reporting exercise. Again,
So
the
we're
FCC.
talking about SAR is there is not a testing protocol that is implemented by a neutral party for SAR. So the specific absorption rate, what we use to try and put a number on the amount of exposure risk a consumer might encounter is only a self-reported metric. So that's like saying, going to Volkswagen and saying how much toxic gas comes out of your diesel cars, and Volkswagen gets to tell you, oh, it's fine, is a problem that we've also run into recently, and how an industry might self-report on its own behavior. And this is also another example of, if we're going to really investigate the situation here, we need good data and good metrics on what the potential causes are. And I don't feel a self-reported SAR is sufficient, given the current climate that we're in, and where we're going to go with the future of things like 5G technologies.
Yeah, especially when you're going up there into the high, like the multi-gig, double digits gigahertz, and you need multiple transmitters to cover a city block. That's more of that those waves going around in the air.
It's more
So,
radiation
and
saturation.
considering that SAR, like they've been able to find that phone to skin contact, the SAR actually increases. Like it's like 20 times the limit in Europe. Like it's like 2 watts. You're getting 40 actually when you actually put contact into it. So that's that's one of the odd things
and
that
this is something that we can draw. We can draw metaphors to other types of exposure. In sitting down with an audiologist, it's duration and intensity. So it probably doesn't matter what wireless technology you're utilizing, if it's 2G, 3G, HSPA, LTE, 5G. That probably, it would be my guess, and not a very educated guess, but it would be my guess, that the type of signal matters less than the intensity, the focus, the duration, and the proximity. And that proximity and intensity are probably linked logarithmically, that the closer you get, the higher the intensity is going to be. And it's not going to be directly a linear relationship between distance and intensity. Just like with audio, if you cram a driver into your ear and you blast that sound with a focus and with a seal directly into your skull, you're going to do more damage in a shorter period of time than if you listen on speakers that are well balanced for your environment and you don't have a lot of noise to overcome. I think we can point to a number of those. I take phototherapy for my psoriasis. So I have these targeted UVB rays that, if I get too close to my skin with one of these mobile units, I can very quickly deep tissue burn my skin. And so the proximity matters significantly in the amount of exposure and the intensity to that exposure. And if I back off like more than a foot, I have it's almost a negligible impact on my ability to treat my skin problems. I feel that there is probably a working metaphor for how data and communications interact with the human organism. And what we need is an actual grown up consumer health examination of what that potential might be. And we need to start looking at those trends over time and how those trends relate to changes in consumer behavior. Because I don't want to get to, my daughter's generation finding out that the reason they all have cancer is because we weren't diligent enough beforehand. And let's say that we spend this money and we spend this time and we examine this infrastructure and the cancer risk is very, very low. That's still phenomenal data to help us build onto the next generation of services. We'll be so much better prepared for the next rollout, the next implementation, and the next category of devices as we enter into an age of personal area networks, full body implementation of sensors and smart trackers and
smart diapers.
Right. We have smart diapers now and clip-on sensors for babies. We should probably have a conversation. And I'm not saying that the industry absolutely needs to halt all progress until we come up with a definitive answer, because that's never going to happen. But we could still be creating guidelines and trends now, which will be better behavioral exercises for us later on.
And speaking of those guidelines, again, the wireless industry has had its hand in creating those guidelines, or at least trying to urge, organizations like the World Health Organization in doing so. One of its former heads, like it was a couple of trade associates actually paid his former employer, and then the former employer transferred that donation over to the WHO. And there's a lot of conflict going on. But when they met to discuss a study, concerning, it was the Interphone study concerning this type of research. The industry was able to secure a couple of firms for observer status. It had 2 experts on the panel, and more professionals just looking into the case. And while they weren't able to prevent it from being classified as a carcinogenic potential, or at least some sort of a classification.
No, isn't the classification in the division of 2A to 2B from probable to possible?
So
That it is a possible carcinogen as opposed to
2B
probable.
as a probable, which
Right.
ups up the stakes a little bit. So, and there's word, now that from scientists inside the circle, that the WHO could be looking at this classification and reevaluating it this year. So that's after research coming out of the US's National Toxicology Program, as well as recent measures in France, I believe, that discouraged devices being on in classrooms and for kids. So there's more on this subject that is being moved on in terms of being more cautious towards the potential impacts of wireless radiation. So that could be something.
More than anything else, because I mean, we've had a number of different types of study and cancer studies on things like types of radiation, non-ionizing radiation, et cetera, et cetera. None of this I really feel rises to the level of, lock your phone in a Faraday cage and only use it in tiny sparing usage. But when we look at an entire philosophy of mobile data driven lifestyle, there are some trends that I think consumers are starting to take a look at in the health of a society, in the health of an individual, and in the health of an economy. And I think this just plays a small part in a larger conversation about what is it that we're trying to get out of our technology? How is that affecting our relationships? How is that affecting our physical and mental health? And how best to go about creating a community where we can have conversations about best practices? And the behavior of the wireless industry in regards to these types of scientific studies, which in the 90s were trying to get a toehold on starting off a conversation as to the potential public health impact, makes me nervous when they're following the same kind of information campaigns that we've seen from the tobacco industry. That does not mean that cell phones are like cigarettes.
No,
I mean,
they've provided society with many goods, that the permeation of the internet, especially in places where, again, home internet, is not very good at all. So it's done so much good, and it's allowed itself to cement that sort of goodwill into.
And I still feel that there are significant benefits to our ability to reach out and find digital communities, and to find friendships online, and to engage in commerce, and to solve problems that we have with things like healthcare and education through the usage and the utilization of this technology. But at the same time, I feel that there are a number of people who are likely to complain about the etiquette impacts, the distracted driving impacts, the sleep impacts. We have a whole society of people that are finding it more difficult to wean themselves off of the more addictive aspects of this type of technology. And I do not feel that it is sufficient to say, well, just pick yourself up by your bootstraps, just get good, or just don't be addicted to it. There is a chemical process which happens in the brain with pleasing events that is very similar to things like gambling mechanics. You can't just unwire the human brain's stimulus response reward system for people who are more susceptible to this kind of behavior. We need to have a larger conversation about how we protect those of us who are more vulnerable to this kind of impact. And we also at the same time need to acknowledge, like, it's not going away. So how do we make it better? That's what I feel is most upsetting about a lot of these conversations is, the cell phone isn't going away. We could prove definitively that it absolutely will 100% cause cancer. That's obviously a specious argument that I'm making right now. Obviously, there's no data or research to suggest that. But let's say we had it. Let's say we had the smoking gun. Just like smoking, cigarettes didn't just go away. Cell phones will absolutely not. They're just too useful. But that would encourage us to have that conversation on how do we make them safer? I mean, physically, how do we build them to be safer? And how do we also just have that conversation about human behavior so that we're creating good habits around their use? Maybe you don't need to have a glowing rectangle shoved into your face seconds before you turn off the light and try and go to sleep. We're already having that conversation. Maybe it's not a good idea to put kids in headphones at a young age because it has significant impact to their speech and social development. I had a wonderful conversation with that audiologist talking about that kind of pediatric behavior and learning. That cognitive experience is woefully impacted by locking someone up in headphones. Maybe we need to have a conversation about that. It doesn't even have to be there is a smoking gun doom and gloom 100% predictor on a cancer mechanism or an ear health mechanism or a heart health mechanism. It even just impacts the daily etiquette and society that we're all a part of. Put your phone down and experience this thing that's in front of you right now, and then get back to your phone and figure out what you're going to do in your digital life too. Those little moments, those little breaks, I think have a huge contributing effect to how we interact with each other, and then the focus that we have for interacting with each other online.
Indeed. I think that is a good place to at least pause this conversation for now, because definitely more could be said on it.
And this is the last thing just to wrap up, because we got a number of tweets coming in, but this is from the PN Weekly hashtag from Andrew Sislak. A while ago, I was considering getting a radiation shield for my phone for when it's in my pocket. After not finding any conclusive evidence, I forgot about the whole idea. I wish the industry would dedicate some of their research efforts to look at these important issues. And I think this is one of the things that makes me most upset, because I've been joining the conversation and saying like, hey, I don't see conclusive evidence to suggest that there's a problem. We're never going to get to a conclusion. I feel like, especially in reading this article from The Nation, and again, I'm taking it with a little grain of salt because it has a very obvious perspective. I'm not going to say bias, but The Nation is trying to accomplish something with their editorial structure and style in collecting all of this information. But in looking through the information they've collected, I don't find anything wrong with the data that they have. It's just they're coming to a conclusion on that data as to how it pertains to the wireless industry. But for those of us that have been advocates of mobile technology, who have been fans and enthusiasts of mobile technology, I feel like my conversations and contributions have probably helped the proliferation of mobile technology. It makes me upset to see the wireless industry engaged in similar mechanics to the tobacco industry in how this conversation has evolved. We will not reach a conclusion on this for many years, probably generations, before we'll have a conclusive data set that we can point to say yay or nay wireless protocols can influence cancer. That doesn't mean that we should wait for that. If you're concerned and you're looking at just changing your behavior, maybe you just don't keep your phone in your pocket all the time and you give it a little distance from you, or you wear a headset, or like you just put in earphones and you don't have the phone up to your skull all the time. If you're concerned, those little steps are probably have some kind of influence or impact without terribly disrupting your digital lifestyle. I don't know about like radiation shields, or like, can I make a Faraday pocket? Like it's something that will perfectly contain all of the electromagnetic radiation, and I'll just have like a tinfoil sleeve in my pants, like a cargo pocket. I don't know about any of that, but
just create like antenna extenders that go away from your, like very far out of your body.
Like, well, I'll have like backpacks with like those CB radio like prongs just flapping in the breeze behind us. That's not what I feel this is. But to that same sentiment, we as consumers should be able to have conversations with our elected officials. These are things we're concerned about. These are things that we hope will be examined. But then also, it can also be up to us to start conversations about changing behavior, of not picking up the glowing rectangle every single little time we want that dopamine hit might be all we need. Maybe that's just it in terms of exposure, is just a more reasonable or a more managed approach to how we utilize these products. And maybe that's where we start. But to say I'm like, we're not going to change our behavior as consumers or as an industry until there's a conclusion, means that we risk generations of people with significant health problems to get to that point. It's a risk. It's not a guarantee that we'll see that. But I'm of the mindset that if you are proactive in trying to protect a population of people against a situation like that, that's not wasted effort if it turns out to not be true. That is actually still a benefit, because we will have more and better information on how to make these products and services if we are proactive in our approach. If we are reactive in our approach, then there's the coin flip. Either it is a contributing factor and we were reactive and now we have to figure out what to do with all this cancer, or we were proactive and, oh, there's no real big threat of cancer, but now we know, and we also know a lot more about how to make these products and how to make them and continue making them safely. I feel there is, for me, the argument for being proactive greatly outweighs the risk of being reactive. And I hope you will all join us in this conversation and share your thoughts, share your feelings as to what will make this situation easier to share with consumers. Because I think one of the things that's going to be a negative with this nation piece is the way that traditional media is going to cover it. I feel there's going to be, if they even cover it at all, it's going to be the doom and gloom. Does your cell phone cause cancer? Find out news at 11. And you're like, that's the wrong platform. That's the wrong way to have a nuanced, grown-up conversation about potential health risks.
Yeah, indeed. And so with that, we've come to the conclusion of this episode, number 299 of the Pocketnow Weekly. Hopefully we have something pretty special for you planned for next week, given that there's a special number that we're coming up to. But
very special number next week.
Indeed. So there's that. I don't have any other scripts. So
I'll wrap us up. Don't worry, Jules.
Good. Thank you. I'm just going to look out at the snow. That's blowing.
It's beginning to look a lot like April, but not where Jules is. There you have it, folks. This episode of the Pocketnow Weekly has come and gone, but the conversation continues on Twitter. And please, we hope that you will join this conversation, where Jules is at Point Jules. I'm humbly at Some Gadget Guy, and you can always drop us an email, podcast@pocketnow.com. Where this podcast and Pocketnow is around the internet, Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and Google Plus and YouTube. And don't forget our home site, pocketnow.com. For Spanish speakers, definitely hit up es.pocketnow.com. Shows like this cannot exist without your support. Sharing this podcast with your friends who love mobile technology and dropping reviews so that people can find this podcast is always greatly appreciated. Because ultimately, there would not be a show if it weren't for our listeners and subscribers who have kept us on the air since 2012. The Pocketnow Weekly will be back next week with some fun, exciting discussion. So make sure you tune back in.